Hey, hello, how are you? This is a show for everyone else. Instead of going after top 1% of the world, we dedicate this podcast to celebrate the lives of the unsung heroes and self-made artists.
I think I always, probably from the bouncing around and the kind of the disconnected childhood in a lot of ways, I always felt like the new guy. So when I would meet, students was where I had the most opportunity consistently, but just meeting people who were from a foreign country. And yeah, I just always felt like I could relate, as they're trying to settle into a place where I live and it's home. But yet nothing ever felt 100% like home. Foreigners used to kind of be able to get away with just about anything, frankly, like back in the day, from what I understand. And then over the last 10 years or so, you have to come here in a spirit of partnership and humility and wanting to learn and work. And that's the only thing that works. And people who don't have a clear mission, they're people who can kind of drift and find themselves, quote unquote. But if you don't have a clear mission, it's going to be pretty brutal here. So for me, I would encourage anybody listening in the States or, outside of China to keep an open mind. And for any Chinese listeners or, displaced Chinese folks who happen to be listening to this too, know that there are plenty of people like me who are here sincerely. We want to be part of things and helping to improve the world for all of us a little bit.
Hi there, it's your host, Fei Wu, and I'm super pumped to be back here recording and releasing a brand new episode of Feisworld podcast. As some of you guys already know, I went on an extended vacation in China in March 2018, and while I was there, it was super productive, but I didn't actually get a chance to work on the podcast much. So I'm thrilled to be back here in Boston, Massachusetts, in my own home studio to prepare more episodes and share more stories from unsung heroes and self-made artists with you, my listeners. Today on the show, I have Brandon Davis. Brandon and I connected through Angel Jones' 12-Minute Conversations podcast. Thank you. Big shout out for Angel. And so many good things have happened since I've been on your show. So Brandon runs a podcast in China called Big Fish in the Middle Kingdom. Middle Kingdom here means China, which is where I'm from originally. Brandon himself was born and raised in Atlanta. And he has traveled quite a bit since then because he moved to LA to pursue a career in filmmaking and production, which we talked about briefly in this episode. But more importantly, he made a transition full-time to reside in China about 2 years ago. His show is rather popular over there with the locals because many of his listeners are actually expats who reside full-time, just like Brandon, in China. And it's really interesting to me, someone who was born and raised in China, to watch more and more expats to more comfortably, happily reside in China, moving themselves and often their families and, including their kids as well. So here, one of the highlights, I think, via this episode is that Brendan shares his own very experience with you on how he moved himself there and the food he's been eating, the shows, the podcasts he's been listening to over there, and how he pursue and develop very high quality and long-lasting relationships while he's in China. And as you can imagine, his podcast plays a really big part in all of that. So if you're thinking about moving overseas, why not start your own podcast, right? You can connect with the locals, and English is a rather popular language. So even if English is not your first language, you could still potentially consider starting a podcast in English exactly the same way as I did. English is also my second language. Brendan, since the recording of our episode, has done some really interesting experiment. So if you enjoy listening to him, to his stories, I highly recommend that you reach out to him. In our show notes and on our website, feisworld.com, you will easily find ways to find Brendan's podcast and also ways to connect with him directly. One key takeaway, if you're thinking about going to Beijing during the winter or moving there for an extended period of time, bring your winter puffer because you're gonna need it. Without further ado, please welcome a very special guest halfway around the globe, roughly 8,000 miles away, Brendan Davis, to the Feisworld podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing. That means so much to us. Even better, submit a review on iTunes. We love you so much, and I'll see you at the end of the episode. So, Brendan, first of all, I definitely want to welcome you to Feisworld. And it's such a rare opportunity for us to connect this way. We connected through another podcaster whose goal is to record something like, 10 podcasts, 10 episodes a day.
Yeah. Thanks, Faye. I'm really glad to talk to you in this way. And that's Angel Jones. This really interesting guy. He is from and is still based in Trinidad and Tobago. And he contacted me through LinkedIn and, sent a basically request about being on his show. And I checked the show out, thought that sounded cool and said, absolutely, I'd love to. And he does this thing called 12-minute convos with Angel Jones. And you've been on the show too. And so when I was checking his show out, you had been a guest pretty recently. So I skimmed his most recent handful of episodes. And honestly, I saw Chinese name and I thought, and I saw a little blurb about you. And I thought, okay, I'll start here, because again, I thought, actually, someone with a Chinese name, maybe there's some synergy with what I'm doing. But I mean, I wasn't trying to peg you as a guest. It was more just to hear your story because I figured it would be interesting. And I was right. My instinct was correct. You had an interesting story. And it was so interesting that we know what happened from there. But
yeah, so you reach out to me from there and you put me on your show, Big Fish in the Middle Kingdom, which really piqued my interest as well, because I feel like we're in a way trading places, that I'm now living, permanently in the US, Boston specifically, right. But you are actually living in my home country, which is Beijing, China, for the past year or 2 years.
Yeah.
About that. And,
yes, I moved here in May of 2016, so I've been living here a little over a year and a half, but I've been back and forth for over 4 years now.
So you started this show, and I listened to a few episodes, and I was thinking, wow, I want to know more. And I don't know where your audience come from. I had originally imagined, based on the description, that they would be people living, expats living in China, or people are contemplating to go about, like, how do they go about moving to China by themselves with their family? But to my own surprise, I found the show to be really interesting because as a Chinese person born and raised in China, I was really I'm still very interested in how people are navigating, how foreigners are living in China, which today has really become the norm. There are a lot of you guys over there versus, the back in the 80s and 90s. So
sure. Your instinct is right, and I appreciate what you said because it tells me that the focus of the show is translating. There are a lot of shows out there. I wouldn't say I did extensive research before starting it. I've been planning to start a podcast for years, even when I still lived in LA, and I was planning to move to China, so I knew there would be some connection. But the concept became more and more focused after I lived here. And I had the concept clear probably 6 months before I started it, kind of late 2016, but I just didn't have the time to do it at the time. I was here helping build another business, and it was very, very hectic. So I'm intending this to be something that transcends. Again, I work in entertainment, and I'm trying to do a show that actually can reach a wider audience. I'm wanting to do something that goes a lot deeper. I'm not trying to solve people's daily mundane problems. There are plenty of blogs that do that, especially. There are a lot of great blogs about, hey, if you're moving here, here's how you do this and that and the other. And I would be happy to maybe partner with some of those, as a resource for people and put those on my website. But for me, I really want to do something that's my version. I go for something that's in depth but has personality, and there is the common theme. It's about, my first question is always, who are you? Where are you from? And for you, why China? Why did you make the move? And it's trying to be my version of like a Tim Ferriss, super detailed, super geeky, nuts and bolts of things. And how do you do things, which Trek gets into that area a little bit, but then more the Mark Maron show, where there's a lot of emotional connection and figuring out what motivated people. And again, I have a variety of shows that are my composite of that. But the audience, it's roughly 1/3 to 1/2 China-based, which is kind of interesting. And then it's consistently about 1/3 in the U.S., between 1/4 and 1/3. And then the balance, episode to episode, is spread out around the rest of the world. And what's really crazy is the last time I tallied it up, I'm tracking in it was 78 countries last time I actually did a count.
That's crazy.
It's maybe it is. I mean, there may be, I don't know who the folks are and who knows how people discover things, but I mean, there are like a handful of people in Pakistan who listen to the show. And I've got, I think there are about 18 or 20 people who seem to consistently listen somewhere in Iran. And so it's just all over the place. Mm-hmm. But anecdotally, and as well as what I can track and from comments and things like that, it is heavy on expats in China. And it's also bilingual Chinese people who are here, who are interested to know more about the strangers, And then it's people, I think, like you, it's the Chinese diaspora, if I'm using the word correctly, who are out amongst the English, as they say. And then it's just people who are curious about weirdos like me who would do this.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for giving us that level of details. What I find really exciting about the conversation with you is that in retrospect, I haven't really had that many conversations with real podcasters who are, doing this day in and day out. I'm curious in learning more about how, when you started the podcast, I definitely think there's a lot of personal reasons, and I agree with you 100%. But when you're doing this on top of what you're already doing, you have a job, you have projects, and you're living in a foreign country, how are you thinking about download sponsorship, getting paid, turning into a lucrative endeavor, that sort of thing?
Yeah, well, I'm thinking that those are our aspirational #goals, as the kids would say. On a slightly more serious note, as much as I can muster, I definitely hear what you're saying. And for me, the reason I do the show, there are a lot of reasons that I've ticked off in different episodes and talking to people, but one of the primary ones, to get a few of the obvious ones out of the way, I do it because, of course, it's helpful for me. It gets my name out there, and it's a way for me to communicate. It lets me meet interesting and cool new people and talk to people. But the biggest reason I do the show, I'm trying to flatten the world. I'm trying to make the connections a little less distant. The most practical, fundamental benefit for me day to day is really, it's a mental health exercise, because working as a producer, as a film and TV producer, the fact is that it takes forever often to get something done, to develop, from idea to delivery. It's often years and years, and there's no guarantees. With this is a production that I can control top to bottom and deliver every week.
I love
and so
that idea.
is such a mental health blessing to do this for me, honestly.
I think we should both write about that. And I love when we get so raw and just get to have someone ask ourselves that question and being in a safe environment and really think deep about it. Because I gotta say that if we ask 10 or even 100 podcasters, it really wouldn't surprise me that our answers are not the only ones, that this very message resonates with so many people in the world today, especially those who are pursuing in creative endeavors. I myself, kind of work in advertising for a long time, 10 plus year consulting. And I couldn't agree more in terms of working days and nights and weekends and with absolutely no guarantee that the project would even launch. And it's not even about putting our names on it to be able to brag about it, but just being able to ship. That was such an impossible and painful endeavor. And then here you are anyway. And that's just so liberating to be able to choose your own path and make your own decisions, like a grown-up. I'm going to jump around a bit because I think people's, origin stories are really fascinating. And so for people who don't know about you, you're living in Beijing. That has become pretty clear. And, tell us about how your life in Georgia as a little kid before your transition to LA into like a film and TV sort of industry. What was it like?
Well, sure. Well, I grew up. I won't take you too far back, but I was always, I took to music right away. I was also around acting and theater from like community theater and things like that. But my parents both did different levels of performance and, my dad did some sort of semi-professional stuff and they divorced when I was really young. So about 7 years old, and I was kind of back and forth, and I've lived all over the Southeast, not just Georgia, but mostly Georgia. I say that Atlanta is basically my hometown kind of by default, but I really grew up half in Atlanta or around that area, and then half in this small town in Alabama called Anniston.
No,
that's
Alabama.
Wow. Yeah, that's where it was about half and half, and I moved to LA from Atlanta. As an adult, I lived in Atlanta for years, but as a kid, especially, my mom is from this place called Anniston, Alabama, and her parents were my grandparents on my mom's side were about the most consistent people in my life, because they stayed in the house. It's like the second house that, they had a house when they married, and then they built a house, and that's the house they were in for, decades and decades. And my grandmother, decades after my grandfather died. So growing up, very chaotic in a lot of ways. I was a pretty weird kid in that I was very much created fantasy worlds, and we moved so much that basically I was always the new kid. I was in 10 different schools over the 12 years of 1 through 12.
Oh, wow. That's a lot of schools.
So I was always the new kid and was not naturally athletic. I was naturally a musician. So I was able to, and I was, relatively funny or,
what kind of music?
So I was able to make friends in that way. My first career, I joke that my first career is failed rock star. I was a hard rock lead guitar player. Oh. And so growing up, the assumption was that I was going to actually be like a professional guitar player. That was my assumption. Mm-hmm. I ended up having like a professional band. Everybody who plays at all has like, they're a high school band and maybe they knock around in college. And I had that band too. But I actually I formed a real professional band where everybody but me had been signed to a major label. It was like a for real band. We were showcasing for major labels and had offers, and we were on television, and I was on Star Search in 1995.
And I assume this was when you were in your 20s or so?
It was really 20s. It was from, it was contained from about 21 to 28, 29.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So, people often ask me, what is the consistent theme across Feisworld? And I realize that, when people struggle with the guests' professions, like, oh, there's an FBI agent and there's an artist and there's a Cirque du Soleil performer. And, oh, that's a little confusing. But I think at the end of the day, everybody who has been on the show are self-made artists. And many of them are unsung heroes who have done, touched so many people, have done tremendous things in life, but not at all household names that you wouldn't even bother to find out about them, right? What I also love about the journey of talking to different people is simply to show others that, people like us or like them have not and will not give up on our dreams. And it takes maturity. So I think your journey as a rock star and as a film producer and now doing something it's a podcast that you're doing, maybe kind of small in scale compared to what you see as this uber success. But it's the making of, is the journey. I feel like it's so often missing in popular media. Therefore, it gives people the false assumption of overnight success. Or some people say, I understand. Totally. It's not literally overnight, but here's the thing. They imagine it being something like 6 months to a year is what I'm saying. So that's also false. But I want to kind of fast forward just a little bit into your moving to LA and then your pursuit in media. And how did that transition happen? I mean, how did you pick yourself up and say, let me try something different. Maybe I'll be good at this too.
Sure. Well, I can get, and again, I don't mean to overshare. I'm friends with people from the past, and although I live very much in the present and kind of halfway in the future theoretically, but but basically did the band and working my way through college. But my degree was in film, and so I had been working doing live sound. I was mixing shows, from clubs. I ended up doing bigger shows later, but I mixed music as a job while I was in college, while I had my band. After college, pursuing the band but paying the bills, I switched into doing sound for film and TV. So I was a production sound engineer, I was a boom operator, I was a utility sound guy. So working on film and TV shows. I did the technical work on other people's shows for about 12 years and based out of Atlanta. So, I worked all over the US, I worked all across Canada, different things. And so I had always wanted to move to LA. I was always drawn to California, had never been there before I moved. I made plans a few times, once kind of, just testing the waters, and once was kind of serious. And then I got really busy and it didn't make sense to leave. But things lined up. The most accurate way I could say it is that my house was in this part of Atlanta in the south, and I was just north of the airport. And I was in a place where the planes didn't fly overhead and there were storm windows, but you could hear like a low rumble, like kind of all the time. And I woke up this one morning early and was going to head into work. And I didn't realize something was strange. I had no idea what was going on, but I got up and got my coffee and kind of sat down in the living room. And I was just sitting there thinking something felt really off and really, really weird. And I realized it was just deathly quiet. And I turned on the TV and I watched the second plane fly into the tower. So it was the morning, September 11, and quite literally like almost dropped my coffee and just like, what the hell's going on? And so of course all the traffic was shut down at the airport behind me was the deal. And then that made me realize I've got to do what I need to do here. I'm going to need to move. I don't have everything figured out yet. Yeah, I've got a house. I'll figure it out. I'll rent it. I'll sell it. But I need to go west. And I'd never been I've been all over the country, but I'd not been to California until I drove out there with a car full of stuff to move.
That's really interesting how we make our decisions. And I think especially when it comes to such major event of the century, in this case, that I've heard several stories of people making life decisions based on that moment of reality and truth and just clarity. Give me a sense of how many years you end up spending in LA.
Yeah, so no, I lived in Los Angeles 14 years prior to moving to Beijing. So I moved to LA 2000, summer of 2002, and I moved to China in May 20th of 2016. So I moved to LA specifically to switch back into writing, producing, and directing, which was what I studied in school. I love doing the technical work. That's part of what I enjoy that part of doing the podcast too, because I can edit. It's my little chance to do that. But I moved to LA with the intention to flip the switch on that. And I still worked a few years in the technical world to pay the bills, but I was able to start doing that. I made a short film, didn't set the world on fire, but it was shortlisted for Sundance Film Festival. Did not get in, but I got to meet a lot of people. That led to my first feature film that I produced, which led to the next one, and on and on. So I produced a bunch of, independent feature films, $500,000 or a couple $1 million, somewhere in that range. And, several things that, I've been lucky to have, be part of films that have played at all the major festivals around the world. And so started to get a little attention, although I wasn't the creator of those. And meanwhile, I was also, one of my mentors says you can get rich producing, but you can't earn a living. And so because it's feast or famine in a way. And until you really do have some giant hit that financially sets you up, it is really a grind. And that's true for, writers or directors or actors, especially. The actors have it as bad as anyone.
What I do think is very interesting is that as a Chinese person who has lived in the US now for half of my life, so that's what I say it was, 17 years, I noticed something really fascinating going on that, yes, I have a lot of American friends, obviously. I also have a good number of Chinese friends, but in comparison, they are a small fraction of my local American friends. I feel like I know a lot of people like you and similar to you who find themselves to be so intrigued, so fascinated by Asian culture. It doesn't have to be Chinese culture. In some cases, it could be very specific, right, to the different regions and in Asia, but even sometimes Asian in general. And they find themselves as if they're almost stuck in a way that they are so shocked by how much in common and how much they have to say and share with their Asian friends. Do you find yourself feeling that way, sometimes or when you're living in the US or no?
Yeah, I think I always, probably from the bouncing around and the kind of the disconnected childhood in a lot of ways, I always felt like the new guy. So when I would meet, students was where I had the most opportunity consistently, but just meeting people who were from a foreign country. And yeah, I just always felt like I could relate, as they're trying to settle into a place where I live and it's home, but yet nothing ever felt 100% like home.
Interesting.
So I think that was the connection.
Because on the other hand, right, like I've also come across people who are incredibly uncomfortable connecting with people from a different culture, different country. And then here's people like myself who really are from a different culture to begin with. And we now get thrown into a hodgepodge, a place like the US where we get to meet everybody. And I notice, what I mean by that is I notice where people from certain culture are really only comfortable and would prefer to hang out with people from that country, speak that language. Whereas I absolutely love meeting people from all around the world. I love meeting their families. I love homemade meals made by their parents and their grandparents. I love listening to the funky music. As you were just telling me that story, because that's kind of how I felt. And then by nobody's surprise, that you ended up nowhere near home. That's really cool. So I would love to learn something kind of similar to what I just expressed, but through your own experience, your eyes. And so what is your friends network like in Beijing right now? Are they mostly expats? Are they local people that you just bump into and make friends with?
No, great question, and I totally I understand that, and I think it ebbs and flows, and it depends on the specific group. I mean, I have plenty of local friends, and I was lucky to because I had so many, quite literally several hundred Chinese students. A lot of them are back here. And through them, I've met people. I mean, I don't hang out with former students that much, but we're definitely, a few of us are connected. I mostly know, up until recently, I've mostly known Chinese people. I don't hang out in the expat bubble at all. I mean, I do.
Good for you.
Not at all.
Why not?
Let me walk that back. I mean, it sounds like that's not a position. I should say that I used to rarely hang out in the expat bubble. In the previous company that I was building, I was the only foreigner. I was the only Wagoran. But fairly recently, in the last few months, because of the podcast, most of the expats who I've gotten to know are through this podcast, because that's who I'm interviewing primarily. You were a reverse Lalai guest, for people who wonder how that came about. Every so often, I like to get somebody who's made the opposite move. So that's how you ended up on the show. But, I was meeting foreigners that way. But fairly recently, I've gotten to know a lot of people who, food and beverage world, people who own or run a bunch of the bars and restaurants, or the Beijinger, which is the big English language media outlet here. And getting to know a lot of these people, all of a sudden I realized, here are all these longtime people in a group. Here are these expats, here are these people who've been here 10, 20 years, all kind of gathered together. So I've sort of gotten to know a lot of people pretty recently, but most of the people I deal with day to day are actual Chinese people.
So let's talk about the expats for a second. What is the breakdown of their nationalities? That are mostly Americans, or are they literally equally divided from all over the world?
What I know statistically that, I just saw some figures at some presentation, somebody's PowerPoint, and it was a Chinese government man who was speaking at this thing. And I know that South Koreans are actually the largest by numbers. They're the largest expat group in China, followed by Americans, and then followed by, I forget the breakdown, but European heavy. And in terms of my world, a lot of Americans are probably the dominant group, but it's not homogenous. Switzerland and Belgium and Singapore. I'm just thinking off the top of my head, Canadians, quite a few Canadians, it seems like.
Out of the I don't know why this fascinates me, but out of the Americans that you meet, sounds like there's definitely, I'm not surprised, there's a big bulk of them. And also just the landscape of North America is quite huge. So, and I also think Americans generally are exposed to a lot of Asian cultures, believe it or not. Where are these Americans from? Like, which states? Where do they grow up? Or, where they last stayed in the States?
Well, it's funny. I seem to meet, because I'm primarily a producer, and I'm working to build a new company right now. I actually don't have a job other than producing big fish in the Middle Kingdom. So I'm working to build a new company. And what I can say right now, without jinxing it, is that there is one American partner, and then there's a Chinese guy. And the Chinese guy is from Guangzhou, although he lives here, but he's from Guangzhou. The American guy is from Michigan, but he became a Hollywood guy, and then he moved to Australia. And so he's been all over the world. And so that's I know Americans who are here, a lot of the entertainment people, a lot of them are LA, some are New York, but most people I know in LA are from someplace else. Mm-hmm. There are a handful of natives. But what I could say that I think everybody would nod their heads and agree with is that, you have to somehow have this interest in the spirit of adventure to be here. And there are all these expat cliches from when you lived here. It's a bunch of alcoholic, quote unquote, English teachers because you speak English natively and maybe you like to drink and it's a cheap place to drink. And I would say that was really one of the big cliches. And now the expats who are thriving here, foreigners used to kind of be able to get away with just about anything, frankly, like back in the day, from what I understand. And then over the last 10 years or so, you have to come here in a spirit of partnership and humility and wanting to learn and work. And that's the only thing that works. And people who don't have a clear mission, they're people who can kind of drift and find themselves, quote unquote. But if you don't have a clear mission, it's going to be pretty brutal here.
Yeah, I can imagine that. And I love when you said foreigners used to get away with anything. And I remember that being the case when I was very young, I would say. Speaking of which, those are some of my first memories. And, I remember there were shopping malls that are only people with white skin and blue eyes can get into. And by the way, that was such a turnoff for my family. I remember that was something that left such bitter taste in, sort of the conversations that just went around. I remember as a kid, and my mom had something so strongly against it. And she would purposely, the moment, I remember it was called the Friendship. It's right in the center of Beijing. Is a very, very old shopping mall, and you won't even recognize it anymore because it's so old. It's called the Friendship Mall, and it was we even had ratings for them, so had very high rating, had very many luxury brands, and right. I remember being 5 or 6 that my mom will take me there to get certain things, but will always teach me what the brand represented. And then obviously for many reasons that we wouldn't go there because we didn't feel like it served us and it respected us. I did this whole thing that went on and it was so severe, And then I think all of a sudden, I've been here for a long time, 17 years. And when I first got to the US, it was a very different environment where I felt like I need to behave, I need to represent, I need to really build the reputation for Chinese people. And now these days, exactly like you said, there's, the whole thing just keeps on shifting while I'm still here. I think you really pinpointed something just about 5-10 minutes ago. It's really advice for people who are thinking about moving to China or elsewhere, really moving from A to B. I encourage especially young people young millennials to consider is maybe either in school or after school, go to a country where you do not speak the language. That will be most ideal, and try to live and enjoy the culture and not just survive, sounds so severe. Have fun and then, fail. And, for a year, I think a few weeks or even 6 months just doesn't feel like enough. But anytime, once you reach a year, there's so many stories you could tell, the grocery stores you went to, all the new cuisines that you learned to make. And speaking of which, what type of, what's your diet like? I mean, do you make yourself Chinese food? And do you go to McDonald's all day?
I do. I've always loved Chinese food, even, before I had quote unquote real Chinese food. Living in Los Angeles, there's an area east of Los Angeles called San Gabriel, and it's a series of different cities and towns. And there are over 2,000 authentic Asian restaurants, mostly Chinese and then Korean and then Japanese. And to where they fly the little ayis and little grandmas are, bringing the spices back in their suitcase. And so it is legit. And so I was fortunate that I got a lot of really authentic Chinese food with Chinese friends in Los Angeles to kind of prepare me.
Tell me, since I'm somewhat familiar with geography in Beijing especially, where do you typically hang out in Beijing?
Well, I live in Shilipu. So for people who have never been here in Beijing, kind of the expat bubble is really centered on this area called Sanlitun. And Sanlitun is where the giant, even if you've never been here, there's a huge Uniqlo athletics store that was in the news a few years ago for some scandalous activities that happened in a dressing room. But it's at the Taikoo Li Shopping Center in Sanlitun, and there are probably hundreds of bars and restaurants around there, and it's this giant center of all these Western, and there's plenty of local brands too, but like high-end stuff and daily stuff. That is a convenient place where I meet people a lot. But in terms of what I do, I try to meet locally. There's some great places near my home because I'm in a real convenient area as well for people. And it's a really kind of good part of town for meeting and whatnot. And I also get up to Chijoba, which is the arts district,
of course.
but it's really the super cool, funky arts district that was like converted industrial warehouse place. But there's world-class art galleries and boutiques and restaurants there and lots of meeting spaces. There's co-working has become a giant thing here. So there are some pretty swanky co-working places. There's this outlet called the Naked Hub. It has become this giant China brand. It's kind of like the Chinese WeWork, but it's more upscale.
So it's kind of crazy. I just feel that I'm living vicariously through you right now. And then you're talking about my hometown where I spend half of my life, but so often that I go back that I don't even recognize. I'm lost all the time. I'm shocked. So this is really interesting. So if you don't mind me asking, what is the rent like in Beijing?
I mean, there's a huge range. And from what I can tell you that it's going up, and on the, there are all these different tiers, right? I mean, there are people who are expats who are executives with a company, and they come here and they will get maybe a 20 or 30,000 RMB a month housing allowance. Okay. And so there are apartments that are 2-bedroom or 3-bedroom apartments for people that maybe have a family who are sort of at the executive class of folks. So, but for instance, I mean, I have a lovely studio apartment, and it's 7,000 RMB a month, which is about 1,050. But if you live in a place that's more, funky, you could pay half that to have a room in a shared apartment. I have to live by myself.
So, what are some of the takeaways, or is there, other final words you would like to share with my listeners? If they're living in the US or in China, if you want them to contact you, that could be one option. But sure. What are some of the final thoughts and words that you like to share?
I mean, wrapping up, this is an adventure for me, and I really do enjoy sharing it. That's, again, a big reason I created my podcast. So, crazyinagoodway.com is my site, and you can learn about the show, and you can contact me through there. There's links to everything. Your episode, of course. I mean, they're all there on the blog page. But I would say that, again, but my personal mission for being here is related. I mean, there are my own issues of wanting to learn and discover and be part of this future that is being grown, as we speak. And with all the geopolitical stuff going on, educate yourself. Don't believe everything you read, and definitely don't, regardless of what, where you fall politically, don't believe what any one or two or three politicians have to say. The truth is probably somewhere between all those opinions, with a lot less, rhetorical heat behind it. So there are plenty of great sources where you can get less biased but more accurate insight into China. So for me, I would encourage anybody listening in the States or, outside of China to keep an open mind. And for any Chinese listeners or, displaced Chinese folks who happen to be listening to this too, know that there are plenty of people like me who are here sincerely, where, we want to be part of things and helping to improve the world for all of us a little bit.
I love that. No, it's just so gentle and beautiful. And Brandon, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for reaching out to me and giving me the opportunity to connect with you. And I'm sure because of this, there's so many more stories that will be shared. And yeah, thank you so much. It's been great.
Thank you, Faye. I really love your show. And next time you're in Beijing, the hot pot's on me.
Hi there, it's me again. I want to thank you very much for listening to this episode, and I hope you were able to learn a few things. If you enjoyed what you heard, it would be hugely helpful if you could subscribe to the Feisworld podcast. It literally takes seconds. If you're on your mobile phone, just search for Feisworld Podcast in the podcast app on iPhone or an Android app such as Podcast Addict and click subscribe. All new episodes will be delivered to you automatically. Thanks so much for your support.